Hello. Today I will be presenting my research project. I decided to name this project as Ellington Experiment Structure, Emotion, and Innovation in Reminiscing in Tempo. And well, my goal is explore how this piece functions not only as a musical work, also as a space where personal grief, artistic innovation, and historical context meet. I will argue that reminiscing in tempo reveals how Ellington composing with emotional urgency and he expand his musical language in ways that challenge the jazz at that moment. Okay, before I start to talk about this piece, I would like to say why I choose this piece. So I choose this work because for me it stands apart from almost everything Ellington wrote in 1930. This piece is unusually long, is 13 minutes divided in four movement, four sections, I will say. And this piece doesn't follow any standard jazz form. This piece was written in 1935. This is right after the death of Ellington's mother's Daisy. And, well, his mom was the center of his emotional life. And this give me this lead guiding question that is what happens when Ellington used jazz not to mainly entertain but to mourn. To understand this piece, it helps to look at what was happening around Ellington in the early 1930s. The Harlem Renaissance had recently passed his peak, and but the influence was still everywhere. Black artists were experimenting, taking risks, and redefining what art could be. Also, at the same time, the swing era was just beginning. Big bands were expected to play music that people could dance, music that was loud, energetic, and very rhythmic. And especially for white critics, they saw jazz mostly as an entertainment, not as a space for deep or serious artistic expression. So when we have a look about all of this, uh, we can see that Ellington wrote Reminiscing in Tempo, and he was basically going against everything what was happening at that moment. The piece doesn't swing, it's really long for the market, I will say, and it refuses to fit into a category. It's really hard to categorize this piece. In a way, for me, this piece is Ellington pushing back and claiming the right to make something personal and emotional. The most important biographical detail about this piece we have is Ellington's relationship with his mother. Daisy was a constant emotional anchor, and it was the person who supported Ellington at every single stage of his life. And when she died in 1935, Ellington was devastated. And while he wrote most of this piece while he was traveling in trains during a long tour. And after, while he was checking the score, he was crying at the same time. And I think it's important to know this because this is one of the rare moments when Ellington composes not for the public, not for make something that sells. Uh, he composed for himself. He composed because it's a way. and then he can express his feelings. Now we can talk about what is reminiscing in tempo. This piece is about 13 minutes long and it's divided in four connected sections. Unlike this jazz of this period, there is almost no improvisation. Instead, the writing is highly controlled, motivic, and emotional. The work resembles a kind of jazz tone poem. For me, this is something more close to a extended classical form, but is still deeply rooted in Ellington musical language. Talking about musical analysis, I will highlight the five main musical elements that stood out during my analysis. The first one is motivic writing, second one, textural contrast, third, harmonic instability, fourth, rhythmic flexibility, and fifth, large scale continuity. So, talking about motivic reading, this form use small melodic cells. It's like tiny gestures that return again and again, but always in alternated form. So this kind of obsessive repetition for me evokes memory. The music circles around ideas without any resolution, suggests the emotional loop of grip. It's like remember something or returning somewhere. We cannot forget that Ellington used his band as a lab and he constantly used it for experiment. And I think in this particular piece, we can see a lot of that because Ellington changed the texture. You can hear some moments where the full band play and suddenly there's just some instruments interacting and talking each other. There are some passages more transparent, and there are also some solos and some mute, and there's a lot of different changes of colors. Also, something really interesting for me was some emotional chapters that guide the listener through different states. There's moments of intensity, reflection, tension, and release. And I highly recommend go and listen to this piece with these thoughts in mind because at least for me was a completely different point of view. The harmony language is also unusual for this period. There are some chromatic lines, avoided cadences, and prolonged sequences without a clear tonal arrival. This creates a sense of instability appropriate for this piece. And during all the work, the harmony refuses to settle down. About rhythm, well, we have like flexible pull, stretched phrasing, and meditative flow. And Ellington music normally were short songs, typically able for dance. And in this one, the sense of motion became blurry. It's not that clear, and sometimes there's these big melodic ideas. They don't have a clear sense of pulse. About the structure, well, this piece doesn't follow a standard AABA song form. These are four interconnected parts. Uh, yes, but Ellington never said these were different movements. I think this was more than like the limitation he had for recording at that moment rather than a suite with different movements. But when we think this as a something emotional and something psychological. For me, there are different parts in this piece, and we can call them like assertion, reflection, turbulence, and closure. About critical reception, when Reminiscing in Tempo first came out, it wasn't received well at all. Many critics thought the piece was too long, too serious, or simply it was not jazz. They use words like self indulgent, boring, and confusing. And here we can see one of the strongest voices against the piece. He is John Hammond, and he was a hugely and influential critic and promoter. But he had very fixed ideas about what jazz should sound like because he believed jazz had to swing and it had to stay close to the dance tradition. And because Reminiscing in Tempo didn't fit in that model, he attacked Ellington with this piece. For me, this tell us something really important. Many critics, especially white critics, expected black musicians to entertain. For me, this was something also about racism. They didn't expect black musicians to create extended and emotional complex works. So, in a way, Allington was punished for being ambitious and for stepping outside of the commercial box. Of course, in this moment today, the perspective is really different, and now we can see why this is one of the ever, uh, biggest pieces of jazz ever made. With all of this in mind, I would like to talk now about that. My main argument is that Reminiscing in Tempo represents one of the earliest and clear moments where Ellington begins to negotiate what it means to be a serious composer. This piece is not just about grief or personal expression. For me, is Ellington testing what jazz could be in a world that constantly tried to define and limit him. In the 1930s, the idea of a serious composer in the United States was almost always associated with white, classically trained musicians. Because jazz, of course, was expected to stay in nightclubs and it was short song, danceable rhythms, and predictable form. Ellington, of course, knew this, but he also knew he could do more at that moment. So when Ellington finally write this 13 minutes composition with almost no improvisation, for me he's doing more than a writing personal lament. He's asserting that jazz and specifically black music creativity can extend the musical thought at that moment. All this, the motivic of the development, the chromatic harmony, and the continuous flow show Ellington with the same kinds of structural questions that classical composers took for granted. For me, he was asking himself, why can't jazz do this too? At the same time, of course, we have this emotional weight of the piece, all of this instability, the constant transformation of small moves, and the refusal of set down. Uh, but this is why this piece is so significant because it reveals a version of Ellington that is some often overlooked. A composer who is grieving, yeah, but also a composer who is trying to expand the expressive and structural ambitions of jazz. Reminiscing in Tempo is a turning point, not only because it was understood, but also because Ellington was pushing for large scale music. And he will do the same in his later works like Black, Brown, and Beige and A Tone Parallel to Harlem. In other words, my argument is that the piece is both deeply intimate and quite revolutionary. It marks the moment where Ellington begins to claim the space of a long form composer, even when the world around him wasn't ready to recognize that role. About the significance of this piece, I think understanding why reminiscing in tempo matter means looking beyond the piece itself. One of the key reasons this work is so important is because it forces us to rethink the historical narrative of jazz. At least for me, when I imagine a long form and ambitious jazz composition, I always think in figures like Charles Mingus or Miles Davis. But Ellington was already pushing in that direction in the early 1930s, long before these musicians took jazz into larger and more complex form. Ellington was experimenting with ways of stretching musical ideas across extended time and emotion. This piece also matters because it challenged our assumptions about what black composers were allowed to do at that moment. Works like this remind us that black musicians were not only innovators in rhythm and improvisation, they were also deeply engaged with structure, form, and long range musical thinking. During this project, a question came to my mind, which is what might black musicians of that era have created if they had not been forced into narrow commercial roles? This question is not hypothetical. It invites us to imagine a musical landscape where artists have the freedom to explore form and narrative. All of this without external pressure. This project also matters for the way it blends biography, musical analysis, and reception history. By looking at the personal circumstances behind the piece, the musical decisions with that, and the critical response around it. This same approach can be applied not only to other Ellington works like Blackburn and Page, also can be applied to other composers that expanding jazz expressive scopes. Musicians like Mingus, Mary Lou Williams, and even Maria Schneider, they continue a tradition that Ellington helped make possible. As a personal conclusion, studying reminiscing in tempo remind me how powerful music can be when words are not enough. I think as a musician, we often feel that the need to express some things that simply don't fit into language. And I think that's exactly what Ellington does here. What also strikes me is how he refused to fit into what the industry expected him to write at that moment. He didn't try to meet the standard of what jazz should sound like. He didn't try to do something for entertainment or something that could be sold. Instead, he chose honesty over expectations. For Ellington, this piece became a way to turn grief into something beautiful. He was not trying to impress anyone, he was trying to survive the loss of the person he loved the most. And by not trying to fit into a mold, he created something that continues to speak long after him. Thank you.